to it. That is a really dangerous precedent to set. It's dangerous to even reaffirm this notion in the first place. So I'm not sure I'd even support the Senate version at this point.
Are you concerned about a repeat in 24 of what happened in 20 with the same dispute over the electors?
I don't know. That's a hypothetical that's a bit far in the future. I'm not sure I'm that worried about it. I'll tell you this, though, that election is years away, and we don't need to be rushing on bad legislation right now to change the Electoral Count Act.
I mean, so the former president obviously played an active role in primaries throughout this year, had a lot of success, had some setbacks too. You think just broadly looking forward, you think it's in the best interest of your party for the former president to be the nominee again in 24?
You know, I think it's in the best interest of our party to have everybody who's thinking about running to run. I think it's in the best interest of our party to have a wide variety of candidates running and let the people choose who that might be. I'm not going to tell President Trump not to run or say that it's even not in the best interest of our party. Everybody who wants to run should. He should give the people that choice. And that's how I feel about it.
Yeah.
I'll probably stay out of that primary.
Okay.
I think that would be the best political decision for me, at least. And I certainly don't envy anyone who wants to run in this particular time in our primaries. It's divisive. We've manufactured a ton of divisions on the right. A ton. We can get it. I think you want to get into that a little bit. Yeah. But it's not a great time. But look, good on them if they want to run. And I think everybody who's thinking of running should run.
Are you interested in running?
No.
Okay.
In 24?
Some news.
Yeah, no.
There will not be a Crenshaw for president campaign, in 2024 at least, right?
Yeah.
I want to talk more broadly about the former president in terms of how he is viewed in the two parties. Because it occurs to me, and having written a book about 2020 and 2021 and interviewed a lot of Democrats and Republicans, we're living in an extraordinary age in a lot of different ways. One of them is this private versus public posture that we see in both parties, in which the two parties are not fully candid about what their actual views are because they obviously operate for public consumption quite a bit. And with Republicans, at least the leadership class of the party, the donors, the lawmakers, the strategists, I think the consensus, it's fair to say, is that the party elites want to move on from Trump. In fact, they wouldn't be too sad if tomorrow he left the public stage. Conversely, the Democratic Party in public is contemptuous of the former president, if you hadn't noticed, and views him as a direct threat to American democracy. Operationally, though, Dan, they very much rely on the former president. He is the cohesive that keeps Democrats organized. He's the best tool for mobilization among Democrats. He's the best tool oftentimes for fundraising among Democrats. And the last few weeks have proven that when he is back in the public eye, it is oftentimes better for Democrats. Is this why people are so damn cynical, Congressman, in which you have two parties who say one thing in public and operate differently in private about, in this case, the former president?
Yeah, and that's kind of what's happening here. Maybe so on the conservative side, or on the Republican side, on the Democrat side, I think maybe two different things are happening. I think on the Republican side, there's probably that confusion is genuine, right? I think there's just mixed feelings.
Unpack that, the confusion.
Well, I think there's just mixed feelings. Like, I mean, I hear from voters and donors and activists all the time. Like, they really love Trump.
Yes.
They love him.
Right.
But they won't necessarily say, "Oh, I definitely want him to run again."
Right.
So, you know, there's mixed feelings.
There's misgivings about him as a candidate in 24. Yeah.
Sure. I mean, it's because there's still a lot of love for President Trump, and so. Again, does that result in
him as a nominee?
Preference? And
that's the great question of our time.
And we won't know the answer to that unless he runs, unless we see it. So I think the mixed feelings are genuine. I don't think there's this like sinister underneath, like we got to say this in public, say this in private. I think people just have mixed feelings. I think on the Democrat side, I actually do think they want him to run. Like I think operationally, like you said, they keep making him the center of attention and maybe want to run against him. And that does seem disingenuous to an extent. But look, I think this is a very human issue where humans have mixed feelings on things.
Do you hear these euphemisms? Because I certainly pick them up from GOP voters when they talk about the former president. Look, they're never going to wake up tomorrow and say, you know what? You guys were right. He was a bad guy. He was a bum. I regret ever having voted for him. I've seen the light, and let's send him to Rikers for life. That's never going to happen. What you do pick up, though, I think, is sort of euphemistic references of, I love the presidency, love his policies, but, you know, maybe it's time for a new generation, or, look, he was great, but he just couldn't keep his mouth shut. And I just wonder if those references tell us anything about the future in terms of how the grassroots views the former president.
I think they do, and I think if you're somebody like DeSantis or Mike Pompeo, you should probably be listening to that.
Yeah, because those kind of euphemistic references could give them a certain level of encouragement, right? That people may have liked the policies, like the presidency, but want somebody else to lead the charge next time.
It's possible.
Yeah. The current president, in some of his more unguarded moments, of which there are many, given Joe Biden's a tendency to be candid about things, seems to be really welcoming the possibility of a rematch. He did an interview where he was asked about a rematch and basically said it wouldn't be the worst thing. Come on in, basically the water's warm. But Biden seems to be almost inviting this rematch.
That's what I mean. Yeah, that's what I mean. That's my perception. It's my perception on some of the actions that they've taken.
Yeah.
And so, maybe he thinks that obviously the implication is that Biden thinks Trump is easier to beat than any of the other candidates. Polling might suggest that he's right.
Yeah.
I'm not sure how great the polling is on this at the moment, but
sure.
It's a consideration. In the end, that's left up to the voters in primary season, and that's why, look, I encourage everybody who wants to run to get in.
Right. One last thing about the former president, and then let's talk more broadly about politics, and that is, for at least 7 years now, the approach that a lot of Republicans have taken with President Trump has been one of two things. Either let's not confront him because somebody else will do it, or let's not confront him because, look, he'll just fade away. People will lose interest. Americans have a short attention span. This thing can't last. But we're now 7 years on into the Trump project. Neither of those approaches have seemed to be effective. Was it a mistake to not try to confront the former president after the election, when he would not concede, when there was the opportunity to impeach him and then convict him?
Well, geez, was it a mistake? I don't think so. Again, these are human issues. These are complicated issues. It's not this there's not this smoky room of wise men for the Republican Party that decide on what the Republican stance will be, and then that opinion just filters down to the people.
That's a great example.
Nothing like this happens. There is no establishment.
Yeah.
People talk about the establishment all the time. There is no establishment.
Right.
You have leaders. You have leadership in the party,
but their tools are less now than they've ever been, right?
Yeah, I would suggest that they are, and I always find it laughable when some of our more fringy politicians or media pundits who can truly whip up a bunch of people because their audience is the most impassioned group of people. They're the establishment, by my mind, and the fact that they self-victimize and are like, the establishment's trying to keep us down again. I'm like, no, they're not.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I don't think that this decision could have been made, right? I think a lot of politicians, they look to what their base wants, what their people want, and in the end, they are representatives, and they're representatives of people's opinions, and so, people didn't want Trump, people on our side at least, did not want Trump impeached, right? We wanted to move on from that. We didn't want to make him, there's a few reasons for that. One, I think the way we don't have to get into it.
But that raises the sort of existential question that we all know in this room, which is, are folks sent to Washington or Austin to simply represent the view of their constituents, or are they sent there to offer, to paraphrase Burke, their best judgment?
Yeah.
It's
a great question. And do you want me to answer it? Or keep going?
Please.
Yeah, it's the trustee or delegate question, and obviously you don't want a robot in Congress that simply, okay, this is the legislation, I'm going to put out a poll on my website, and whatever wins, I will vote that way. That would probably be an improper way to govern. I mean, the reason we elect people is because we trust them. We trust their judgment. They run on a set of principles. They say, look, this is how I think about problems. This is how it should be anyway.
Exactly.
All right, I'm not saying it is like this, but it should be this way. This is how I think about problems. These are the issues, where I am on the issues. On issues we have not yet tackled yet, this is how I think about things, right? These are my principles. So vote for me, and I will vote for you in Congress. And because the things we vote on are extremely complex.
Yes.
Extremely complex. Probably gives you an indication of maybe how complex our society, but also maybe how the overreach of our federal government has gotten, that we have to decide on so many things. And so even in Congress, you have to split up into different specialties.
Yes.
Like, you know, it's like you get a major, you get a minor.
That's right.
You know, with me, it's like national security, energy, healthcare. These are things I focus on. But, you know, you start asking me about other, you know, on what's going on in financial services, I'm not so sure. So you need to work as a team, and you need to trust your delegates. But there are still some issues where you do have to just go back to the people and think, like, because it's a preference.
Yeah.
It's an emotional preference sometimes, very political. And it is beneficial to look to what your constituents are saying and what kind of calls you're getting. We pay attention to that stuff.
Now, I think you mentioned this. They were reflecting the will of the grassroots, especially on the House side, these more conservative districts. And the sentiment among the grassroots in the party was to move on. We, in our book, This Will Not Pass, to make a second, hopefully final plug for the book, maybe a third will come. There's this moment right after January 6th where one of your colleagues, Bill Johnson from Ohio, says, look, Trump should pay a penalty for the riot. He shoulders blame for that, but our voters don't want to hear it. They're asking me, what about Hunter Biden? What about Hillary Clinton? Where's the accountability for them? And that to me was so revealing, Congressman, because it does capture in a lot of these districts that are more sort of partisan drawn. You know, members are sort of listening to voters, and the voters, at least on their side, are living in sort of information silos, right and left. And that's what they think. They don't want to hear about Trump's transgressions. They want to focus on the other side's transgressions. And I think that that vote after 2020 reflected that will. But let's go more broad here, because something I know you're passionate about is in your own party, the actors who I seem to be imitating some folks on the left, and I think you actually have a phrase for them. Tell us about that.
No, the woke right?
Yes.
Yeah.
The woke right, he says.
Yeah. And
what's
like,
the woke right?
The woke right. Okay, so when I say the woke right, I'm referring to people, often disaffected liberals, who could have been Bernie bros, but in a split second chose a red jersey instead. And I see more than that. They mostly live online.
Yes.
Right? This is more of an online phenomenon, and you know, if we're being honest, we have to wonder what happened to everybody who believed in QAnon, who were part of the alt-right. I mean, these organizations have sort of been dismantled, but the people never left, and so where do they go? And like I think there's a lot who want to wear a jersey and just scream at the other side, and they remind me of the far left more than anything. And so when I look at the similarities between these, and I'm not going to name names because it's not beneficial sometimes to name names, but I'll give descriptions, and I think, and I ask my audience, and I certainly ask my base. I mean, this is something I talk about at Republican events a lot. That you got to look out for certain things. You got to look out for certain attributes, the way someone is speaking, the things they're speaking about. If the first words out of their mouth, for instance, are rhino and establishment and globalist, right, you can rest assured they're not very thoughtful, and they're probably about to lie to you. I mean, really. So, you know, I'm just sick of it because it's manufactured divisions. Frankly, the conservatives on the right have never been more aligned, ideologically speaking. I think you used to have a lot more truly liberal Republicans in the Republican Party. And so there's always that 10 to 20% that is desperate to be contrarian.
Yes.
So that's a key principle of the woke right: contrarianism over principle.
Yeah.
If the mainstream is for Ukraine, then we're against it. In fact, we hate Ukraine.
Right.
It's nonsense. They self-victimize too.
Yes,
they self-victimize. Here's how this process goes. Say something outrageous and super provocative. Watch people react to it. Claim victim that they would dare react to what you just said, and then blame the establishment for it, and then fundraise off of it, or get, if you're a politician. But I would say mostly social media influencers and political pundits do this kind of thing, and they're looking for engagement. There's a business model here.
Yes.
To keep you upset, to keep you unhappy, to make you think, as a conservative, that your own party is against you at all times and trying to betray you, and that you should be perpetually unhappy. The other key thing between the far left and that woke right is they don't want to win. Winning is definitely not their goal, because then they have to have some responsibilities, and that's not what they want at all. And so maybe we can talk at them at length, but it is a phenomenon that I think has just gotten stronger, maybe in the last year or so. Maybe that's primary.
And the incentive structure is geared toward more provocation, more inflammatory rhetoric, more lighting of your hair on fire rhetorically. Isn't that part of the problem here? Look, you won't mention names, but I will. Marjorie Taylor Greene, one of your colleagues, somebody that you've clashed with publicly, she doesn't care what committee she's on. She doesn't care if she won't be able to work with the Appropriations Committee to get an earmark for her district. She's not concerned about sewer or water funding for North Georgia. What tools do leaders have to change behavior if the actors, people like that, aren't responsive to any traditional characteristics?
Yeah, they don't have many tools. And again, there's no establishment. It's a myth that's perpetuated by people like her. And, so my plea is to the people. The people, and I'm asking our voters, to think through this. This is why I expose some of these attributes. Yeah. And what I show you is, look, the fighters aren't actually fighting for you. They're fighting for your attention. And there's a big difference between fighting for your beliefs and fighting for your principles and trying to gain some wins and victories on your behalf, and just fighting for your attention. And I think when you phrase it like that, some people click and they're like, I guess maybe that is what they're doing. Yeah. Because what have they won for me? They don't write any actual legislation. They won't negotiate anything. It's just fire and brimstone all the time. But whose fault is it? It's all of our fault for allowing those incentives to take place. And social media has been a huge part of that, where you're incentivized by extra clicks, and you get extra clicks by engaging in rank dishonesty and conspiracy and outrage, and that's a problem that we have to solve. We're so engrossed in the Jerry Springer show and Kardashian drama that like we want it in our politics too now, and nobody says that. Everybody's like, no, we don't. We hate it. Well, yeah, that's how we're voting though these days, and that's how you're engaging online. And so that's an American problem that we need to solve, and it's a cultural problem that we have to solve.
So let's take this to the next step, which is the practical impact. If Republicans do have the majority in the House next year, which I think is a distinct possibility, I guess the first question is, will Kevin McCarthy be Speaker, do you think?
Yeah.
And Congressman, how does he govern a conference in which you have people who are not responsive to leadership, cannot be challenged, cannot be undercut, cannot be intimidated because they have their own constituencies? How can he effectively control that conference where you don't have those tools of leadership, where John Boehner and Paul Ryan were effectively driven out by the same actors? How can Kevin govern, if you will, his own conference this time?
Kevin's an amazing politician, so if anybody can do it, he can. I certainly don't envy the position that he's
he wouldn't trade places with him, yeah.
Like first strategy is elect as many good governing Republicans as we can, and we've all been trying to do that. So that's the first strategy, and then help them win in November so that you have enough numbers. And Kevin's also done a great job reaching out to those kind of people and making them feel involved. And because that's always the complaint we hear. We're not involved. Again, I'm not sure it's true. I think it's a lot of self-victimization, but in the end, it's certainly helpful if you're just talking to everybody and you bring everybody in. And that's what this Commitment to America has really been about. It was announced today.
Yeah.
And that's, behind the scenes, that's been a lot of giving everyone a voice and the time to say, look, these are the principles that we'll focus on. These are the outcomes we're hoping for. And you've had a say in it, and you didn't complain about it then, so don't complain about it when we're actually in charge. Yeah. Right? And there's a message. That being said, there are plenty of people who will always find a reason to vote against even the NDAA. I mean, we had this argument in the conference the other day.
The Defense Reauthorization Act that's passed every year, yeah.
And the leaders, the ranking members, Mark Rogers, who got that done, and people were still opposed to it. He's like, I'm sorry, it doesn't cure cancer.
Right.
The bill doesn't cure cancer. You're still going to vote. I mean, and that's kind of where some people are at. If it doesn't cure cancer, I'm not for it.
So we hear a lot about the Freedom Caucus, right, and about the sort of more provocative figures, the Matt Gaetzes, the Lauren Broberts, the Marjorie Taylor Greenes, Scott Perry now. And we know that they could be difficult for McCarthy to sort of wrangle. Have you had conversations with the non-Freedom Caucus members of the Republican House Conference about how do we keep the train on the tracks? How do we act as responsible stewards of the House? And yes, how do we find strength in numbers to try to marginalize or at least manage the Freedom Caucus?
Well, first of all, not all of the Freedom Caucus is that way either. Sure. A lot of the Freedom Caucus wants to have that conversation as well. Okay. You know, you'd be surprised what kind of internal divisions there might be there.
Interesting.
You know, so Matt Gaetz isn't even part of the Freedom Caucus,
right.
Actually. And so, look, everybody kind of runs their own district in the end, or not runs, but you know what I mean. They represent their own district in the end. But yeah, that conversation happens a lot. It actually does. I mean, maybe informally. But I think in the end, there's a lot of good people. One, a lot of good candidates that I'm excited about that I think want to be part of solutions. And there's a lot of people who just don't get enough credit in our conference, because they're not that loud. They're working a lot. They're actually thinking about difficult and complex legislation, and they don't get enough credit. But there's a lot of them, and so you know, to a certain degree, I think we should be a little bit more optimistic than maybe we are.
Will you impeach President Biden next year, do you think, if you have the majority in the House?
As a conference, I mean, McCarthy has said he's probably not in favor of that. It wouldn't go anywhere. We wouldn't win that battle. And then you gotta come up with what are the legal arguments that we would impeach him by. The best one would be, dereliction of duty, refusal to execute the laws passed by the Congress, and which is a very clear duty of the executive in the Constitution.
Are there grounds, do you think, there?
Via the border, yes. So I think there's very clear grounds on the border. Again, does that mean it's politically viable and makes any sense? Does that mean you want Kamala Harris to take over? Because that's really the question. And so those are the kind of discussions.
And the Senate wouldn't.
Yes, he would never pass the Senate.
I just raised that because you guys are going to have to walk this line next year of both trying to placate the loud voices in the party who want to impeach him, and from day one, and those larger numbers in the conference who want to find areas of compromise, but also want to do accountability, but perhaps just not impeachment, right?
Yeah. Well, we want strategy that wins. And that's the key difference. Again, my frustration on the right has been it's manufactured. Yeah, whether people call themselves nationalists or populists or conservatives or MAGA or whatever it is, I'm like, what's the difference, guys? What's the difference between my ideology and Jim Jordan? We don't have a lot of difference, actually. Yeah. And well, Jim has actually been a very productive member. So I'm not even. That's probably not a good example. But even Marjorie. So let me use that example. So our difference in tone is massive.
But on policy A, B, C, D, and E.
And also, like, some of these people are also just more willing to get real extreme real quick. Like, look, I am for zero tolerance at the border, no illegal immigration. Right. I would take drastic measures to stop that. But somebody else could still outflank me.
What would you do?
Well, I'll get to the policy. Sure, but my point is, somebody could still outflank me and say, yeah, I mean, that's true, but I'm a real conservative, so I want to stop all legal immigration, too. And people will do that. And so that's where the silliness occurs, I think. Where it's like, geez, I mean, I guess you're never conservative enough, and it's totally manufactured. That's what frustrates me. On the left, it's not. I mean, the left have serious ideological divisions that they'd have to sort through.
I want to delve into this, where the party goes, what the GOP should stand for, because it does feel like we're in a moment now in American life, these extraordinarily tribal times, where the two parties are largely organized, or at least sort of held together, by antipathy toward the opposition rather than a shared support for a proactive affirmative agenda of their own. I think the poli-sci crowd calls it negative partisanship. It's a powerful force. Congressman, what should Republicans stand for? Not we're against the left, but what should they stand for proactively, affirmatively in 2023?
Well, look, that's one of the reasons McCarthy held this press conference today in Pennsylvania on commitment to America, because it is, if you're going to be an adult in the room and a governing Republican, then you have to say what we're for, not just what we're against. We're definitely against a lot of things.
Sure.
What we're for, I mean, in very simple terms, I would say, we are for a limited government philosophy that increases prosperity, and we're for ordered liberty and safety and security. And so those are the basics. And then now you dive into different issues. We can go into more details. But you have to start there. And there's a fundamental psychological difference between the left and the right that I think is is consistent through history and through all countries. And there's two different visions of what a government's role is. And one vision would say that the government can solve a heck of a lot more problems than you realize if you just give us enough power. And then there's the other vision that says that's not true, that's unrealistic, you're not taking in second and third order consequences into mind, and it really shouldn't be solving a lot of the problems that you're asking it to solve. Okay, so from those two visions come very obvious differences in how you solve problems. And look, I think our priorities should be energy, making sure that we have energy security. I think our priorities should be the border, making sure that we have border security, enforcing our laws at the local level as well. That's obviously something Republicans are, and so we're trying to win local elections to enforce that. Look, we're pro-America leadership in the world, despite I think what some of the fringier voices would say about what we should do. We want to keep more money in your pocket as opposed to giving it to the government.
Fair enough. Let's start with the energy issue and sort of drill down, as it were, on that, because you do come from sort of a Houston area district. You grew up, I know, in Katy, outside of Houston. You sort of are very familiar with the oil and gas culture. But I don't want to totally out you here, but you're also still in your 30s. You have a long life ahead of you, and obviously want to leave a world for future kids and grandkids. Tell me how you balance trying to find climate solutions while at the same time representing a heavily pro-oil and gas district.
Sure. So we're for rational environmentalism, not radical environmentalism.
What does that mean?
So, well, it means that we look at the facts and we look at the data and then we come up with solutions that are assessed through a cost analysis, as opposed to rank ideology and almost a religious adherence to a two-solution future, which is solar and wind power only. I mean, these people don't even like nuclear. They don't like hydro. They don't like a lot of zero-carbon solutions. They scoff at carbon capture, even though it's actually being commercialized. There's a plant in Houston that's been doing this for years now, and actually just hooked up to the grid, powers 7,000 homes, takes in natural gas, recirculates the CO2 through some proprietary blend and process that they have, has zero net emissions, and powers and can be profitable. So there's a lot of solutions that are just scoffed at by the radical environmentalists. So what does looking at the facts mean? I mean, okay, let's take the UN climate change report, right? The IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And I'll be going to COP27 this year, just like I went last year, because I believe that we need cleaner energy.
The climate summit that took place in Scotland last year, yeah.
And so if you look at what the literature actually says and what the consensus says, the UN report, well, the key question you have to ask yourself is, what is the cost of climate change?
Right.
And so it answers that question, and the cost is actually about a 4.5% decrease in global GDP from what it otherwise would be. So by the year 2100, you would see, if our trends continue, a 450% increase in GDP. Because of climate change, they would assess it's a 434 increase in global GDP. So there's a cost, but the cost isn't what the radical environmentalists are telling you.
Yeah.
They're lying to you about what the actual costs are, and they're lying to you about what your options are. And that's where the rational environmentalism comes into play. So look, what's the number one thing that reduced our emissions back to like 1991 levels here in America? It was the natural gas fracking process that displaced coal. So what's the number one emitter globally? It's about 50% of global emissions come from foreign coal, people burning coal to get power. And so what's the best way to displace that? You can dream of wind turbines and solar panels in these developing countries. Dream all you want. Maybe go write a fiction novel about it. But in reality, natural gas is going to displace that. And it's going to have half the emissions, and you're going to get massive consequences from that. So if you just left the market alone right now, our natural gas producers, and gave them the permits that they need and actually didn't vilify them, they could probably quadruple their exports in the next 10 years. If they quadrupled their exports in the next 10 years, and this is a bit of an if, that displaced foreign coal abroad, that would be the equivalent of everyone driving an electric car in America, everyone getting solar panels on their house, and doubling our wind capacity. But it would have massive consequences.
But you don't think there has to be any intervention in the U.S. marketplace to incentivize the emitters to get to?
There has to be a lot of intervention for nuclear. Because it blows my mind that the Democrats are not more in favor of nuclear. They kind of speak favorably about it, but they will not take one step to make our permitting process better, our regulatory environment better for nuclear energy so that it's more affordable. I mean, it's just, it's insane to me. So you have this rock, and if you just bash it or heat it up, it provides you clean energy for like 25 years. What an amazing concept. And we've had this technology forever. And we just let it go by the wayside. We make it we overregulate it to such an extent it takes 10, 15 years to build a reactor, which is nuts.
Let's talk about immigration, because you mentioned that you feel strongly about stopping illegal immigration at the border. I guess the first question I have is, how do you do that?
Well, we were doing it, right, for a couple of years in Trump's presidency. And the way he did it was disincentivizing the abuse of our asylum process, fundamentally. So he disincentivized that by saying, okay, look, you're claiming asylum, fine, but you got to go wait back in Mexico City. All right? And so people were like, well, wait, I never really had a claim. I was just saying that. Right. And so they're disincentivized to even come across in the first place. And we know that they're just saying that, right? We know that the drug cartels are actively giving them instructions on what to say to claim asylum and get across. Now, these days, the problem is so bad, they don't even have to claim asylum because they're just going to get paroled or a notice to appear sometime in the future, which very few will ever show up for. And all the data from DHS shows this. The data shows a couple things, that they don't show up, and two, that even the ones who do show up, especially from Northern Triangle countries and a lot of the countries that have been coming through, the acceptance rate for an actual asylum case is still pretty low, about only 13%. So you know that most of these cases are bogus. And I think you know that intuitively too, I mean, just being logical about it. So the asylum abuse is a really big one. The Flores settlement's another big one that says you can't even hold people past 21 days if they have minors with them. So that requires basically catch and release. That's a problem. So you need more funding for facilities to actually hold people, process them, and immediately deport them. The primary thing here is no asylum allowed if you're not coming through a port of entry. If you're crossing illegally, that should negate your claim to asylum. We consider Mexico the State Department considers it a safe haven.
Right.
Therefore, you can't claim that you can only claim asylum in our country and pass through Mexico to do it. You can't do that.
Obviously, some governors have recently sent migrants to places like the VP's home, like Martha's Vineyard, which obviously gets a lot of attention. Do you think that is a constructive step in getting to a solution on the issue? Doing that?
It's a desperate step.
Yeah.
It's a desperate and therefore, in our case, a necessary step. And just to showcase to the American people that the D.C. and New York mayors were freaking out for, what is in reality a handful of migrants compared to what we're dealing with on our southern border here in Texas. And showing that, like, see, I'm glad you agree with us. This is impossible to deal with. We just saw a news story right now in South Texas where they're having to cart in a bunch of refrigeration trucks to increase their morgue capacity because so many migrants are dying making this journey. And so I'm just curious where the compassion is on this subject, with the human trafficking that's occurring, with the cartels taking advantage of our system, basically having migrants pay them. And then they'll send them across at a certain point, right. And then they can ferry drugs around because Border Patrol's tied up over here.
Well, you mentioned desperation, and this being a desperate step, but a lot of the people who are coming to this country, who are making enormous sacrifices to try to seek asylum, they're also desperate, and they're also humans, and to put them on a plane and fly them to an island where they don't speak the language, aren't there issues there about being humane, about being decent to your fellow man?
They're not being forced to. They get told that you can go on this plane and you'll be landing here, and it's totally voluntary. So no, I don't think that's a good argument at all. I mean, you can hiss all you want. It's true. You know what's not humane is cutting in front of the line either. There's a lot of people across the world that have valid asylum claims, but they don't have this geographic benefit where they can just walk across our border, across the Rio Grande. I don't think it's very compassionate or moral to allow so many people to cut the line, clog up our system to where our asylum system right now is impossible to navigate. The backlog is in the millions. So what about everybody else in the world that does have a serious claim to asylum and can't possibly get through our system? Where's the compassion for them?
There were questions about just precisely what those migrants were, and we're not told about where they were going and how they got on that plane, but we'll leave that aside because I'm getting the signal here that we have to move to Q&A. But I want to ask you two final things, if I could, about you. Politics, as we know in recent years, has gotten much more combative. It's nasty. American politics has always been sort of rough and tumble, but I think people acting out their social media profiles in real life is now becoming increasingly becoming a real issue. I think people in this room know the number of threats against members of Congress have skyrocketed in recent years. Every member of the 1-6 committee now has a security detail. And you have been harassed by folks at events and hotel corridors, even walking to votes now. Why is this happening, do you think, to you? And what is it about you that prompts this enmity, do you think?
Well, so it's the woke right, because I'm the only one who slanders the woke right, because they slander me. So I'm one of the few who fight against that faction, that sort of chest thumping, principle lacking, emotion-seeking faction, and they don't like that I called them out, and so they'll attack. I mean, I think it really is that simple, to be honest.
But this leads me to my next.
Well, here's another reason. I'll give you another reason, because my name is clickbait, right? If you go after somebody, a public figure, that not really that many people know them, you're not going to get the clicks you want on Twitter.
Right.
And that idiot who harassed me 2 days in a row last week, I think he went on an interview and literally said, I'm just looking for clicks. And so the American people have to be like, I'm not in favor of this anymore. I don't want my politics to be the Jerry Springer show. That's what I want people to think and say, and what I'm asking them to think and say.
What substance there is in the harassment, and I grant you it's not a lot, but what substance there is that I can discern when it comes to you, and this leads me to my final question before we do Q&A, is this growing strain of isolationism within the Republican Party, which I think nurtured by the former president, who has long felt like America should not engage in the world, that we should not be spending money abroad, has never been a huge believer in alliances. But it does seem bigger than Trump now. There does seem to be, and we've seen this on the right in American history at various times, there does seem to be a sort of re-emerging isolationism that is a considerable departure from the era. We're here in Austin, Texas, the sort of George W. Bush era. I couldn't help but notice, Congressman, that in May, when the last big Ukrainian aid package passed, there were 11 no votes in the Senate, and all 11 were in your party. What is happening in your party in terms of foreign policy, and is this going to be something that is truly litigated in the years to come? And could the Republican Party become less of an internationalist party than it has been in the last 30 years?
Yeah, what I tell people is, if you believe in America first, then why let Russia and China dictate what the global order would look like? That's not America first, that's America last. And it's deeply, deeply foolish and misguided. So yeah, I'm disappointed to see that strain. Yeah, it's always been there, just in American politics. I think it was largely living on the left for the last few decades, and it is now. Now I see a lot of these on the right wing really say things that I've only heard from elite university professors.
Right.
About how nothing America does is good. Now you can always make that argument on foreign policy. Everything we do is screwed up because there's no counterfactual. You can't know what the world would have been like otherwise, and so. It's a super easy and lazy argument to make, but they love to make it. We got to focus on what's going on here at home. It's like, well, I'm sorry, what's this false choice where we can't also secure the border here and make sure that a major geostrategic adversary is being defeated without a single drop of American blood? And so, just speaking about Ukraine specifically, it's hard to imagine a better investment where we're spending money. Yeah, we're spending money. Right. But we're not spending it in American lives. We've strengthened NATO. NATO's now expanding. The Europeans and all of our allies there are now extremely weary of Russia and China, by the way. Yeah. The Chinese are looking at this and saying, oh my God, the Russians really overstepped. So now they're rethinking Taiwan. And by the way, the Europeans are also begging for our natural gas instead of Russia's. And now it's pretty safe to say that the Russians are not going to keep invading countries because they can't even get this one right. And that's because of our intervention there. And because look, they wouldn't have been able to defend Kyiv without some of our weapons. And it's one, you know, and once the Russians wanted to literally take over the entire country, it's not just Crimea, not just some of the eastern Donbass regions, it's like the whole country. All bets have to be off, and we should be on the same side on that. But look, I think a lot of people are such rank contrarians on this. They're like, well, the mainstream says this, so I'm going to jump on that bandwagon instead because I'm a free thinker.
But this could be a real issue in January and February of next year if Ukrainians, in the dead of winter, with Russians cutting off gas flows, Ukrainians start to lose support from the European allies because the European allies are facing the brunt of the challenge on the gas embargo. And the Ukrainians desperately need more material. They need more financial help. And Biden sends up a request for more Ukrainian aid. What does Kevin McCarthy do? Can he get through a Ukrainian aid package with today's GOP to Joe Biden?
Yeah, I think so. I do. I think so. I'm not sure how to answer that more complicated, but I think so.
But you think so? It's not a sure thing necessarily.
Well, I mean, it depends on the package, what they're asking for. I mean, like even I have limits.
Will there have
what
to be
I
accountability?
What, oh yeah, like increased accountability, and like I want to know where the numbers are going and why those numbers are necessary. But what we have seen is that what we have done so far has been very effective, and I think that makes for a good argument in case there's more needed. We're not even sure we're at that point yet. But look, we all have limits.
Sure.
It's not unlimited.
Of course.
What any of us are willing to.
But people like you will make the case publicly and privately for why this is a good idea, even though Joe Biden's the one.
Right, even though it makes right-wing Twitter mad. You know, that is what it is.
On that note, let's do some Q&A. Who wants to bring me? Yes, sir.
Our first text question, our texter asked, do you support diverse energy, including wind and solar, or are you proposing we go all nuclear?
Oh, yeah, I mean, good question. No, all of the above, for sure. Wind where it makes sense, solar where it makes sense. I just don't think that these particular sources of energy should receive about 250 times the subsidies that, say, nuclear does. Like, that's nonsense. And what it's done is created real problems with our electric grid. I think that's a big source of the problem we had during the Texas freeze, was that we had this over the years, an overinvestment in only wind and an underinvestment in baseload energy. Baseload energy meaning things that turn on when you need them to turn on. When you have intermittent sources of energy, your grid has problems every single time. And we're not even close to the point where batteries could possibly fix that. Also, it doesn't help when the Democrats want to shut down any kind of mining operation for the materials that you need to create those batteries and solar panels and wind turbines in the first place. So it's not like we're against those forms of energy, but we have to have a much more reasonable energy mix and a much more reasonable policy towards how we look at subsidies, especially.
Our next question is about military service. Given the number of military service members that commit suicide, that happen every year, and that number dramatically increases when service members become veterans, do you think mental health therapy should be mandated before a service member becomes a veteran?
Mandated? No. I mean, we already go through some of these evaluations, and it already annoys the hell out of active duty as we're leaving to go on to the next thing. You know, some broad program I don't think would be helpful. But it is true that it's more likely after they become veterans. And why is that? Personally, since having gone through this and having had to leave the military, not involuntarily, but kind of involuntarily, the whole I thing was a problem. And so I didn't want to leave, but I did leave. And you really lose a sense of mission and purpose, and I think veterans really feel that loss. And it's hard on a lot of them. What I recently got into the NDAA was an amendment that would tell the DoD to start doing clinical trials on different psychedelics that have been shown to really help with PTSD and emotional problems. Psychedelics, yeah. So talking about ibogaine, MDMT, psilocybin, all of it. I mean, there's some really fascinating new, there's some great studies from the VA actually on MDMA, and I think the same needs to be done with ibogaine. Right now, there's a ton of active duty and veterans going down to Mexico to a clinic down there to get this treatment. Now, it's like an American-led clinic, but it has to be in Mexico because of our laws. So, and they're having amazing effects on people that I know very personally, and it's just something we have to be looking into. I mean, there's plenty of veterans who would tell you this thing saved their life, and it's one day of treatment, it's fascinating to me. So there's things we can do.
Yes, sir.
There are a lot of people who want to be fans of yours and see you as a potential brighter future. We see you condemn own the libs type comments, but it also seems like you're often part of some disappointing party line votes. Can you talk about how you navigate what reasonable people hope from you versus the extremes of our politics?
Well, my first question back would be disappointing to who? The thing about politics is you definitely can't make everyone happy. Why do you think Matthew McConaughey decided not to run for governor? Let's be honest. 'Cause everybody loves him right now.
Right.
You run for governor, you're going to piss off a lot of people. That's just the nature of politics, and it sucks. I mean, I don't like being hated by a bunch of people. It sucks, but it is part of the job. That's why they call it service. And so how do you navigate that? Look, you have to go in with a set of principles, and in our case, it's conservative principles. And frankly, the conservatives have not defined those very well, especially for people who don't identify as conservative. And so I try to identify it this way. Look, we go in and we ask a series of questions about a given policy, and those questions are surrounding our limited government framework. We ask, will this have second and third order consequences that we should be worried about? Should this problem even be solved by government? And if so, at the local, state, or federal level? Those are conservative questions to ask. If we give you this service, who are we taking a right away from? Who are we taking liberty away from to give somebody else this, and is that worth it? Right? Those are really basic, principled questions that we have to ask ourselves. And just because something sounds good, and oftentimes a lot of this legislation that you might see me vote against, and you're like, why on earth would you vote against the Beautiful Puppies Act? You know, because honestly, like they're honest, or here's a good one, the Inflation Reduction Act, because it doesn't do what it says it will do.
But if I could interject here, though, I think part of the challenge that we're in now is that people aren't disappointed in the voting record because the litany of issue X, Y, and Z is not the animating force in our politics. The animating force is tribalism, and I think you say things that seem to be like you're willing to reject political tribalism, or at least you see the peril in it, but then you're also somebody who's young enough to want a future in politics, and so you're somewhat limited as to what you can say about the dominant personality in your party, because that could, impact your future prospects. I mean, you seem to be a sort of great illustration of somebody who is torn, right? Because you loathe, I think, I can say fairly, some of the sort of tribal instincts, the provocation for profit BS, but at the same time, you can only go so far when it comes to sort of being candid about President Trump because of where your party is. I mean,
well, how do you know? I personally know him. Like, I do not dislike the guy. Like, so it's not a matter I'm not being dishonest with.
Of course. But in terms of his impact on your party and on American politics, you are limited as to what you can truly say given your aspirations. Is that fair?
I guess. I mean, I think I don't think you get a very different answer from me in private than you do in public. Look, because I've criticized President Trump plenty of times. Right. I just don't go out of my way to hit his mailbox. Right? And so, some people do. And it's just, there's some things that are certainly unnecessary in politics. It is politics, after all, where you don't need to completely go out on certain limbs. And, as far as voting records go, look, I've only been in the House with Nancy Pelosi's in charge. Right. They don't put a lot of things on the floor that I'm even close to being in favor of. Sometimes they do. There's plenty of votes where you actually see some split amongst Republicans. They're like, I do kind of like that, or it's good for my district. It doesn't happen a whole lot, but it definitely happens.
Yes, sir.
Should Congress pass an abortion ban, and where would you set the line there?
Oh, man, I knew we were going to get into this one. So, you see how Lindsey Graham come out recently with his proposal, and I applaud him for doing that. There's certainly a question about whether we should do anything at the federal level. There's certainly a question about that, both politically and legally and constitutionally. Is this really constitutionally something the federal government can even legislate on? His line in the sand was probably a pretty decent one because it's easily where Europe is. It's easily where 70+% of Americans are regarding the abortion question. I'm pro-life, so that means I'm pro-life. There's not like an if there, but that's a moral statement. Political strategy can dictate a different thing, and I don't necessarily disagree with how Lindsey did that. The criticism he got was like the day he did it.
Right.
because it was about inflation numbers, and everybody's like, come on, Lindsay, what the hell?
But would your preference be for a federal ban at a certain point in pregnancy, or would your preference be no federal law, let states pick their own abortion policies?
Probably fine either way. Like, I'm not, look, in the end, I get a yes or no vote, so I don't control what comes to the floor. So if Lindsey Graham's bill comes to the floor, I'm not going to vote against it out of a states' rights principle necessarily, because this is a very moral issue as well for conservatives. And so no, I'm not going to vote against that. But strategically speaking, we've been saying it's a state issue. It's probably the best strategy. You cannot, strategically speaking too, you don't want the policy to get way out ahead of the culture. Right now, the policy is ahead of the culture because there's abortion on demand until birth in many places, and that's just not where actual people are at. You know, and again, I want to be more like Europe in this case, not North Korea. I don't think we're very extreme on the abortion issue.
At what point in a pregnancy do you think abortion should be outlawed?
Well, I think life starts at conception. So life starts at conception. There's no way for me to say that at 12 weeks, the fetus at 11 weeks is less valuable and less worthy of protection than 12 weeks.
Do you think abortion should be illegal even in the first trimester?
Yeah.
Okay. Yes, sir. Next question.
Let's go with, so along the lines of anti-contrarianism, what issues are you focused on that will result in bipartisan legislation being passed?
Oh, there's plenty. Look, I think once we actually are in control of the House and what comes to the floor, you talk about all this, we have a ton of legislation on nuclear, let's say. We're pro-nuclear. Democrats say they are. Let's get them to vote on it. I bet we'll peel off some votes there. I bet that can be bipartisan. I bet some Democrats will be in favor of some of the carbon capture bills that we've had. So those have passed in a bipartisan way, actually. They were my bills and Senator Cornyn's bill in the Senate. So there's plenty. Look, I'm running for Homeland Security chairman. There's going to be a lot of partisan stuff on that, especially with regarding to the border, but there's a ton of bipartisan stuff as well. Everything to do with cybersecurity, cyber protection of the American people and private industry, that can be bipartisan. FEMA reform, Democrats have the same complaints that Republicans have. Let's work together and do that. There's plenty of opportunity there. There's opportunity for oversight of the entire department. You know, does it make sense to have one secretary oversee 17 agencies? How can we reformat that? There's no reason why any of that would be partisan. So, I mean, I only have like 2 minutes left, so I could keep going through plenty of things.
On this note, though, what Democrats impress you that you serve with?
What Democrats do I like?
Yeah. Who impresses you? On policy, on politics, or they're willing to be practical and get stuff done? Any of the above?
Oh, you know, there's definitely some Kurt Schrader on our committee. I'm looking at Energy and Commerce now, who clearly work with us well. What's his name? Now I'm forgetting. San Diego representative, also, yeah, Scott Peters, also incredibly reasonable. I will say the Energy and Commerce Committee in general is oftentimes pretty bipartisan. Like we're working on pretty serious issues, so it gets really nerdy and wonky. But there's a lot of decent bills that come out of that.
Is there one final question?
You mentioned Kevin McCarthy, who some people in this audience may not support. Do you not have faith that the Republican Party would support you if you ran for Speaker?
Oh.
No, I don't know. I don't even know how to answer that. I just would never run for Speaker.
You don't want the job.
I definitely don't want that job. You know, I'm running for Homeland Security chairman. That's it now. So, yeah, it's hard to stump me on questions, but that stumped me.
But let's conclude.
I never even thought about
Let's conclude, though, with your future. We're sitting here to borrow the cliche, deep in the heart of Texas. You do want to be the chairman of the Homeland Security Committee if you guys get back the majority next year. Is your future in the House, do you think, or would you like to serve in statewide office someday?
Right now, I want to serve as the chairman of that committee and win this next election. I'm going to do the politician thing and totally
you really are.
That.
You really are.
Completely, because it doesn't help me either way to give you any indication.
I asked because Ted Cruz obviously is up in 2024 in this state, but he may run for president. He may not run for re-election.
I could firmly say no to that, especially if I get this chairman.
You will not run for Senate in 2024.
Yeah, I mean, I'm already on the best. I'm already on one of the best committees, and so my options next year are either I get to be chairman of Homeland, or I'm still on this great committee versus, you know, running a statewide race, making a bunch of promises he still can't keep, and then going to get a basement office as a junior senator. No, I'm good.
Well, there's the news, folks. Yeah. There's the news. Thank you all so much for being here. Appreciate it.
Thanks.
Thanks, guys. Thanks, Congressman.